Late one evening in March 1974, Princess Anne was being driven down the Mall towards Buckingham Palace, with her new husband, Captain Mark Phillips, and her personal protection officer. Another car swerved across and blocked their path. Its driver was intent on kidnapping Anne.
This man got out of his car and ran back, and the policeman got out of his car and he walked round the back of the car. And when he came round the back of the car, he realised that this man had a gun. There was an exchange of shots. And then the chauffeur tried to get out and he got shot. And then he opened the door and we had a sort of discussion. He said I had to go with him. Can't remember why.
I don't think you really gave a reason why.
No, perhaps not.
But you were quite obstinate about it.
I said I didn't think I wanted to go. Thank you very much. I was scrupulously polite because I thought it was silly to be too rude at that stage of the game. Then he grabbed my arm and pulled. Unfortunately, well, I don't know whether it was me holding on to him or him holding on to me, but anyway, we maintained the status quo for a bit. The back of my dress split from top to all the shoulders went out of it, and that was his most dangerous moment because I lost my rag at that stage, and he then legged it off towards the park.
The police gave chase, and he was caught. Anne may have joked about it later, but it was the most dangerous attack on a royal for a century. 4 men had been shot and badly wounded. The 23-year-old princess managed to avoid even a scratch.
If they were really going to try and kidnap somebody, they certainly picked the wrong person in Princess Anne. She wasn't going to go quietly, oh no.
The Princess Royal is often in trouble. Unlike the kidnap attempt, it's usually trouble of her own making. She's been accused of being rude, sulky, and difficult. She was also the first of the Queen's children to be divorced, and the first and only one to be remarried. At one time, she looked to be the royal least likely to succeed. Yet now, when the royal family is engulfed with problems, Anne seems somehow to have emerged unencumbered and untainted. For years, Princess Anne has fought a ding-dong battle with the media. But her motto seems to be, never apologise, never explain. Her recent conviction under the Dangerous Dogs Act has thrown her into the headlines once more.
Princess Anne became the only member of the British royal family ever to receive a criminal record today. She pleaded guilty this morning to charges that her dog, an English bull terrier, bit 2 children in a park.
Anne was fined £500 and didn't pause for comment. She's never courted the press and doesn't particularly care what they say about her. She learned to develop a thick skin at a very young age. Anne Windsor was one of the very few aristocratic children of the 1950s with a working mother. Anne and her elder brother Charles had no idea their upbringing was unique.
You grow up assuming that your home circumstances are normal. But there must have been an awful lot of strange people that they were asked to meet, come and say how do you do, and when they would probably rather be doing other things. The Queen had to spend a lot of time not only travelling the country, but going abroad and travelling around the Commonwealth. Quite naturally, the children were left at home, and they had to endure a long separation from their children, which obviously they wouldn't have chosen to do.
When Anne was only 3, the Queen and Prince Philip went on a 6-month tour of the Commonwealth. It was the first of many trips that would separate Anne from her parents throughout her childhood. The children were educated at a schoolroom in the palace until Charles was sent to boarding school. Their governess, Miss Peebles, had doted on little Charles, but the willful Anne was more of a handful. After Charles had gone, Anne had to endure a further 7 years of seclusion with her governess until finally she broke the mould. At the age of 13, she became the first princess ever to leave the palace for an ordinary school. Benenden School for Girls in Kent. According to the headmistress, Anne was so nervous that she had been physically sick on the way.
I was at Benenden a year before Princess Anne, and I do remember we were all extremely excited about her arrival. Everyone I knew said, "Oh, what's she like, you know?" And I said, "She's just like one of us." I think Anne really enjoyed being normal. I think she enjoyed the companionship as well.
The girls will know her as Anne of the Lower Fifth, a prospect which Anne certainly looked happy about, surprisingly happy, in fact, for a new girl just starting school.
At 18, Anne left school with average grades. She herself chose not to take education any further. She pronounced that university was a highly overrated pastime. Instead, she thought she'd become a royal full-time. One of her first invitations came from President Nixon to visit America. But she didn't go alone. She went under the protection of her big brother, who could show her the ropes.
It was the start of a sightseeing tour, which left some American journalists critical of the princess.
She was very bad-tempered, very sulky. She really didn't want to be there. That was the impression one had. Helen Thomas, very respected journalist, said, "Princess Anne, what do you think of the Washington Monument?" And instead of saying, "Very tall," she could have answered in 2 simple words. She said, "I don't give interviews."
The reaction against Anne by the American press was instant. They saw in her a royal who didn't like people.
Later, at Mount Vernon, once the home of George Washington, the princess's attitude again aroused American comment. There were some, however, who were prepared to believe that after the strenuous 10-day tour of Canada, the princess might be tired rather than bored.
She's never hidden her feelings. She was more honest than Charles. Maybe she found coming to Washington a tedious bore, and she'd rather be with horses in the country.
Anne had quickly tired of playing second fiddle. When she became president of the Save the Children Fund in 1970, she set off on her first solo visit to Africa.
Hey, you king of the jungle.
She was filmed on the trip by the BBC children's programme Blue Peter. The audience saw a princess they never thought they knew.
Odious creatures. No wonder he's big. Look at the man he's consuming. Does that once more, I shall kick it.
This was not a Mills and Boon fairy tale princess. Anne came across as unstuffy, energetic, and game for a challenge. But sometimes her free spirit led her into trouble. She got her first speeding fine when she was 20, and went on to get 4 more. She was even banned from driving for a month. Doing as she's told has never come particularly naturally to her.
As a small child, I mean, she was always very full of life. She was what one calls a tomboy, really. Like all those types of children, could be quite naughty in a perfectly nice way. Mischievous, perhaps, is a better word. A great contrast to her brother, who was much quieter. He enjoyed his pony too, but not in the same way as Princess Anne.
For Anne, horses were close to an obsession, just as they've been for her mother. When it became clear that she had a growing talent as a rider, her father found her one of the best trainers in the country, Alison Oliver. She understood the princess's thing about horses.
The horse didn't treat her any differently than it would anybody else and reacted to her as a rider and as a person, not as a princess. Her ambition just gradually grew and grew, and she wanted to do well then. I mean, it was not enough just to do it well. She had to really win.
Coming to the water now. She had a foot in the water which ruined her chance for second place at badminton. No chance of in the water this time. Coming to the last. Stood right there.
It had started as just a hobby, but her intense desire to win had brought her to the very top after only 6 years training. She was the European champion of 1971.
It must have been a source of pleasure and surprise and wonderment and a great sense of achievement that their daughter carried off this crown of a different sort against absolutely straightforward competition. No concessions made whatsoever. She was the best, and that was it.
Anne had dramatically emerged from her brother's shadow and was scoring a run of royal firsts. She became the BBC Sports Personality of the Year and was then selected for the 1976 Olympics. But the shot the press really wanted was Anne falling off her horse.
One particular incident at Burley Horse Show when she came flying off, went right under. It was really muddy lake. We were all clicking away, giggling our heads off. If looks could have killed, we'd have all been dead instantly because she was furious at doing it right in front of us.
She didn't like that one little bit because that was always published huge in the papers. I think this may have been the time that she learned to hate photographers.
Princess Anne was always bleating that she wanted to be left alone as a private person and to do her own thing. It's ridiculous. She is not a private person. She's not a normal person. She is the only daughter of the sovereign. The fact that she was Princess Anne has made the interest in her far greater than in anybody else. I'm sorry, it's tough. It just goes with the job.
And their interest was only nominally in the horses. Most of the press pack were far more fascinated by the company she kept and whether they could marry her off. Would it be the Olympic gold medalist Richard Meade, who shared her passion for riding? Or more intriguingly, the 26-year-old Andrew Parker Bowles, not yet married to Camilla. He and Anne were often seen together, but he was a Roman Catholic, and for a royal that in effect put marriage out of the question.
She was perfectly prepared to talk to the press about the sporting side of her activity, but what she wasn't prepared to do was, just as she was about to enter an arena or start a cross-country course, to be asked whether she was going to get engaged to somebody. And this, of course, made her very cross, because she wasn't there to talk about her private life, and that's when she started telling everybody to naff off.
It's the naff off picture when she lost it and told me to naff off, and that created, a storm. But
I think the truth is we made up an F word to cover another word.
Oh, she didn't actually say that.
Well, she said,
I think it might have been in the conversation, but there was a lot of other FF words at the time.
Shorter words. Well, as shorter words.
Four-letter words make good headlines, and the press was in its element. But the episode reinforced Anne's determination to keep the media at bay.
Do you ever regret what you say to them? I mean, the report that went around the world was you told one photographer to naff off, I think it was. Do you wish to retract your choice of words? Or?
No. Well, there was several of them, actually.
By 1972, the word was out that Anne had a serious boyfriend. At first, she tried to keep his identity secret, so she would hide him in the back of her horse box.
You will let us in, won't you? Yes. There's a good chap.
It was a shared passion for horses that brought Anne together with the young army officer, Mark Phillips. When reporters got wind of an engagement, they were desperate to find out more. But Anne's lips were firmly sealed. She wouldn't even tell her own press office.
I set about asking, firstly, the princess if she was going to get engaged, and she said she wasn't. And when I asked the Queen whether she thought the princess would get engaged, she said she wished she knew. And so whenever the press asked me what was going on, I was able to say to them, as far as I was concerned, very truthfully, that she wasn't going to get engaged.
The romance was denied on a daily basis by Buckingham Palace. And I remember one particular press officer saying, no, Princess Anne is not getting engaged today, she's not getting engaged tomorrow, and she's not getting engaged next week either. And 2 days later, the engagement was announced. And that makes the press pretty cross, because they're simply being lied to. And it makes them, in effect, go for her.
Anne had kept the timing of the announcement in her own hands, and it still rankles with the press 30 years on. They'd struggled to get the scoop of the decade, and Anne had outfoxed them. But the battle was only just beginning. Anne's wedding day was one of the most romantic royal occasions of the century. On November the 14th, 1973, tens of thousands lined the streets on the way to Westminster Abbey. This was a royal wedding like no other before it. It was beamed around the world live and in colour. The secret courtship meant the public knew very little about Mark Phillips. On the day, they looked like an archetypal fairy princess enthralled to a dashing military officer. But a pre-wedding interview suggested that in reality, there was an uneasy balance of power.
Do you think that the marriage can withstand the enormous pressures of public duty and publicity that you have to endure?
I think we've stood a great deal already this year.
It can, it's got to, isn't it?
But as far as the home is concerned, you're boss.
Yes.
For those in the know, the question was, what did Anne see in Mark? After all, he was a commoner and the son of a sausage maker. But Anne had once declared, I'll marry the man I choose, no matter who he is or what he does.
He was always quite a quiet sort. He was not well treated by people. You know, the word got out, I don't know how true it was that Prince Charles had nicknamed him Fog because he was thick and wet. That didn't help him particularly.
But that wouldn't have worried Anne. After all, she was the first to get married. Her brother wasn't even at the starting gate. And Mark knew his place. It seemed love would conquer all. 3 months later, their marriage was put to the test by the kidnap attempt in the Mall. The gunman was hoping to collect a ransom of £3 million, but Anne thwarted his plan by refusing point blank to get out of the car. He fired 9 shots, but none at her. and her characteristic stubbornness became a form of heroism.
The situation was resolved around her steadfastness of remaining sitting in the car and not getting out. She was not going to be bullied into doing something that she instinctively knows is totally wrong, and is not going to have hysterics, and is not going to suffer post-traumatic stress afterwards.
For Mark, it was clear evidence of the kind of woman he'd taken on.
It had never occurred to me that I might actually end up in that sort of situation. I think you probably had thought about it beforehand. So it was all a bit of a shock, and it was... I was frightened, I don't mind admitting it. But somehow, while we had a dialogue going, it didn't seem too bad.
He was slowly running out of bullets.
Their friends thought it brought the couple closer together, particularly as their lives changed so much over the next 5 years. Mark left the army and retrained as a farmer. Anne eventually gave up her riding career and concentrated on royal duties and family life. When their first child, Peter, was born, the rebel in Anne seemed at last to be settling down.
You come keep an eye on her, Peter.
In 1981, Anne and Mark's second child, Zara, was christened at Buckingham Palace.
You on profusely quite a lot of the time.
Okay.
But behind the scenes, there were whispers that all was not well. Anne's personal bodyguard, Peter Cross, had suddenly been sacked.
I was told from an absolutely amazing source that he was having an affair with Princess Anne. I couldn't use the word affair, so I invented the phrase that he had become over-familiar with Princess Anne.
When this came to the bosses, of course, at Scotland Yard, they're the people who supply the protection officers. Of course, they freaked out, and Peter Cross was moved out very fast indeed.
Harry Arnold went on to claim that Anne was still seeing Cross after he'd left the palace. It was said she used the pseudonym Mrs. Wallace when she wanted to contact him.
2 years passed, and he then got in touch with me, arranged to meet me. And he then said that when you wrote that story, I was still married, and I couldn't admit it. But yes, it was true, and I can now tell you that it was true because I'm now divorced.
Mark kept quiet, but the press had spotted how much time he was spending abroad.
I think the lowest point was when Mark decided he'd have a life of his own and didn't want to just be the appendage of wandering around in public engagements, and wanted to run his own horse business, building jumps and courses around the world. He went off. She was lonely. And that's when her life started to go wrong. And she was in a house, mostly by herself. I know it sounds hard to believe, but she was alone in a house.
In the glare of publicity, Anne stopped seeing Peter Cross, who left Scotland Yard and went into hiding.
I think that episode tells you, one, she was unhappily married and knew she had made a mistake. It also tells you that she's a very raunchy lady, which we knew anyway. It also tells you that she, once again, would do whatever she wanted to do and would not worry about protocol or royal rules. She simply behaved as she wanted to.
It was around this time that the princess found herself in Fleet Street's firing line. If she was down in the mouth, then she was fair game.
We always called her sourpuss, misery face, the worst of the Germans. One of the things we called her. And she didn't deserve any better, to be honest. She never gave an inch.
The palace were alarmed and proposed she take part in a documentary to improve her image. Anne agreed, with reluctance.
Princess Anne's reputation didn't do justice to the real woman. There was a universal view within the palace that the amount of work the princess was doing was not being reflected in the press coverage she was getting. If you look at her diary of engagements, you can do 5 or 6 things in a day, where any other member of the royal family will only do 1 or 2.
Thank you very much indeed.
The film followed a whole year in her working life.
It's most nice to be.
On one particular day, it showed her visiting a cosmetics factory all morning and moving on to an old people's home in the afternoon.
Well, it's very nice to meet you.
The film looked set to provide the positive PR the palace thought she deserved.
Well, Mary, thank you so very much for coming. You've given so much pleasure.
Well, we've been around a bit, Northampton.
Especially to the old people. You were wonderful with them. You really were.
Very enjoyable.
Well, I think they gave enormous pleasure.
Nice to be able to.
But the next morning, back at home, Anne found she was in trouble again. And her guard dropped for a moment when asked if she minded the headline.
No. It's too late anyway. You tell me, I mean, I don't fit their image as my... I mean, I just don't fit into the slot which they think that I ought to.
Anne seemed resigned to a bad press, but in the end it was she herself who changed the mood. Princess Anne's public image had a makeover in 1982, more or less by chance. She was on a dangerous tour of Africa as president of Save the Children. Normally, the press ignored her charity work, but this time they followed because they hoped her husband Mark would turn up. The marriage was looking shaky, and the tour promised rich pickings for the gossip columns. But Mark didn't show, and the press was stuck in Africa for 3 long weeks with a difficult princess.
We all perceived that we had a problem in trying to report this lady and trying to report this tour. We couldn't phone the office and say, well, she's just being a miserable cow again today and hasn't smiled, so I won't be sending a story. We had to try to change it somehow. And I don't believe we ever changed her. We simply changed her image.
You travel for miles in the dust behind a convoy for hour after hour, and you turn up at a lonely camp, and she would be dressed in a pair of khaki trousers and a blouse and a headscarf. And that was a princess, and it was a different look at her kind of. We've never looked at a princess like that before.
Halfway through the tour, instead of attacking Anne, I rang my editor and I said, look, she is actually doing quite a good job. I still don't like the woman, but I want to write a really positive piece about... I was going to emphasize all the really good things that she did, rather than the bad ones.
The entire press corps changed tack. In 1982, such close access to a working princess was something new. Anne was hot news and good news.
Princess Sourpuss turns into caring princess. That's what happened. We knew her as the Sourpuss, and she became a caring princess. It is a magical transformation.
Survive a bit longer.
I don't think Princess Anne gave a damn whether we were writing nice things or bad. But even she would appreciate that with the amount of publicity we gave that tour, it brings the pennies rolling in for her charities. She can't achieve it. She needs us alongside.
At the end of the tour, Anne agreed to pose for the cameras. Reporters thought it was her way of saying thank you.
We'd been all around the refugee camps in Africa, and Anne, who never gives official pictures, was obviously persuaded that she ought to do an official picture. We were by the Victoria Falls. There was nothing, there were no refugee camps, no despair, nothing. And so she said yes, she would do this.
We reporters and photographers took up our position, and she posed for about 15 seconds, turned and said, well, are you going to move or shall I? Of course, it wasn't long enough for the guys to get the shot they needed.
And that was our photo call. She stormed off in the car, big clad, just shot.
Anne's behaviour was typical of the woman the press had come to know and love.
Well, it's actually quite unbelievable because in all the years I worked with her, I never had a conversation with her, and I don't think she ever even said good morning to me. I was like this woman photographer that she knew and saw regularly, all in the most strangest parts of the world, but we never had a conversation. And I think the only time she ever actually directed any language to me was in a field up in Ladakh where there was another photographer tiptoeing across the crop, and I think she thought we were ruining the crops. She turned around and said, "Get off." And that was about the only interaction we ever had. I mean, it's unbelievable after all those years.
How many years we're talking?
Over 20 years.
And sometimes you'd be on your own with her?
I would. I'd be standing on my own in the most remote part of the world, and I wouldn't even get good morning.
I suspect this is something of her father in her. I think the Duke of Edinburgh can be very abrupt, can be very dismissive of the press. He hates the press, she hates the press.
There was a time when you, I think, went on tiger shoots, presumably those days.
I never went on tiger shoots. I went on one shoot.
Not a thing that was...
Shot one tiger that happened to be lame at the time, anyway. And I imagine he weren't even born then, anyway, so I don't know what we know about it.
Anne and the Duke of Edinburgh are actually very, very similar characters. In many ways, I think Anne is the son that he wishes he'd had.
Even as a child, Anne's strong and sometimes obstreperous behaviour was actively encouraged by her father. She was much more a chip off the old block than her more sensitive brother.
She's just like Prince Philip. She's a strong part of the royal family. She's as strong as he is, takes no nonsense, takes no prisoners.
By the mid-80s, there was a new princess on the block. Princess Anne had become old news.
She was extremely annoyed when Diana became centre of stage. And then Fergie became centre of stage as well for a while. She said about them behind their backs several times, "Those girls." She viewed them both as lessening the stature of the royal family, too much tabloid for her.
Did you take your eyes off her when Di came on the scene?
Oh, totally. Diana,
we dropped her like a hot potato.
Diana swept the world. Diana became the highest publishing picture everywhere.
And when Diana started her charity work for the Red Cross, her hands-on approach caught every eye and every lens. Inevitably, comparisons were made between the two sisters-in-law.
There was Diana on the one hand, who was incredibly touchy-feely, who hugged the children, who put children on her lap, who even kissed people, grown-up people in public. And there was Anne, not touching anyone, not playing up to the cameras at all. She does seem to be very, very businesslike. But she gets the work done.
But when the press suggested that Anne should learn from Diana's example, it made her angry, especially as she was clocking up twice as many engagements a year as Diana.
I know that in private, Princess Anne said to one of her colleagues, I work hard every day. I get nothing. I'm never in the paper. No one ever thanks me. All she has to do is turn up. And that, I think, sums up their relationship. Diana stole everyone's limelight, and Anne resented it.
Anne responded with a flurry of appearances on television. She'd always been wary of the media, but now there was a playful and flirtatious princess on display.
Lately, there's been tales, for instance, of you and the Princess of Wales not exactly hitting it off. I mean...
Yes.
You don't...
That was one of their better fairy stories.
A year earlier, the royal family had gathered for the christening of Prince Harry, all except Anne.
Oh, it was a great shame that we missed the christening, but I was only given the choice of one date. And I'm afraid, as far as we were concerned, particularly with, it was a date that my husband had fixed, And he was away in Australia when all this came up, and it was
So
all...
you're blaming Captain Phillips for it?
Not totally.
The reason she couldn't be there is because she and Mark were going on a rabbit shoot. A rabbit shoot? Royals shooting rabbits? It wasn't a fixed engagement that she had to do. I can't mix this. It was a rabbit shoot. It was a game. She was playing games.
Which was?
Showing that I don't like Diana. I wasn't asked to be a godmother. I don't like the relationship. I don't like all this razzmatazz and show business. I'm going to do my own thing. And here I am doing my own life.
For their 10th wedding anniversary, Anne had joined Mark in Australia. For some years, she'd scrupulously hidden the true story of their failing marriage. Now she was confronted about it on an Australian chat show. Anne had secured a £3,000 donation for Save the Children for her interview. Inevitably, the producers wanted their money's worth.
There have been rumours recently about divorce and unhappiness. Are they true or untrue?
What are we doing here? There's a lot of areas, in fact, which ill-informed gossip has been, going on for years, in one thought or another.
But how do you react when you read these stories?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, really. And that it depends, I think. I think to a large extent you ignore them. But then if they start to persist and go on and on and on, then it starts to become a bit trying, and you eventually feel that... I feel that I'm sort of dying to get an opportunity to say something, to knock it all over.
Yes.
I know that even their closest servants believed that they would remain married forever. After all, monarchs in the past have soldiered on when they've been miserable with their spouses. But this was the one that was going to break the mould.
April 1989. Princess Anne had been the victim of a crime at Buckingham Palace. Letters had been stolen from her personal briefcase. They were from her secret.
The inquiry was unusual. You're dealing with a theft in a royal palace, and the victim happens to be a princess. You then find that what's been stolen are letters from her lover. You then have to deal with that by interviewing loads of people in palaces in the full glare of the world's media, and this very soon became the most talked about story.
The stolen love letters were from one of the Queen's personal servants, Commander Timothy Lawrence.
Until that story was printed, nobody had ever heard of Timothy Lawrence. There was this guy, a bachelor, living a lonely life in the West Country in a small flat, suddenly hurled into the limelight, and the whole panoply of the royal family. It must have been a terrible shock for him.
I have no comment to make on the news at all.
Anne had taken a shine to Tim as she watched him serving the Queen. She was still married to Mark at the time, but she made regular visits to Tim in Winchester. The press still can't believe how she got away with it.
The neighbours knew. That's the extraordinary thing. Most of the people who lived in the road knew that Anne was coming there regularly for weekends. I mean, oh yes, Anne, she comes, but no one had ever told anyone. Extraordinary. I think she had loyalty even in, they all liked her. Oh, she's a lovely person. She just says hello, and I've seen her doing the washing up. And she sort of gets loyalty from people who don't know her, have nothing to do with. No one thought to ring a paper or tell us.
The stolen letters exposed Anne's affair, and Scotland Yard's Serious Crime Squad were called in. 500 sets of fingerprints were taken, and almost everyone at the palace was interviewed, including Anne and Tim themselves.
They were good witnesses for me. They were upfront about it. They were not ashamed of their relationship. They were clearly disturbed by the fact that it had been revealed in the way it had, but they were completely open, and Commander Lawrence's only concern was trying to protect the princess.
The investigation lasted 4 months, but the thief was never identified.
Frankly, we came up against a dead end, and we went to the princess and said, look, we're very sorry, we cannot tell you definitively who stole your letters.
But the letters had shown up the true state of Anne and Mark's marriage. Separation followed swiftly, then divorce in 1992. While the world was fixated on Charles and Diana's failing marriage, Anne was managing her affairs with a minimum of fuss. Her dangerous liaison with Tim could now be made public, and Anne made sure it happened in the way she wanted. When a royal photographer, Jane Fincher, arrived to photograph Anne at the 1992 Caledonian Ball, she got the shock of her life.
She arrived, was shaking hands with everyone, and I was sort of photographing her doing all her formal sort of greeting, and then I spotted him sort of 10 feet behind, and I thought, my heart stopped, and I thought, oh my God, you know, he's here with her. The band struck up, the first dance started, and she instantly got up with him and started twirling around the dance floor. But then excitement turned to sort of worry, because then I thought, well, if I take a picture of them together, she's going to go absolutely mad. So I just sort of, squared up, walked up to her so that she could see me coming, so that if she decided she didn't want me to do it, I would be taken off to the Tower of London. And it was really weird because she just kept dancing and smiling. Not like Princess Anne I'd seen before. And I just kept taking pictures and I didn't get chucked out. Nobody told me to go away, and I was almost encouraged. It was the first time I'd seen her look truly happy for years and years and years. And I just thought, well, good for her, and I was really pleased for her.
Anne hadn't exactly acknowledged her photographer, but she'd used her to their mutual advantage.
Timothy, you look a magnet.
The last one is a single man.
2 weeks before Christmas, Tim Lawrence awaited his new bride at a small Scottish church. Second time around, this was more Anne's style. No fanfares, crowds or carriages, just family, friends, and a wedding breakfast of soup and wholemeal bread, and the press at a safe distance away from the action. Tim moved into the marital home at Gatcombe, whilst Mark had moved to the farm next door. Life continued as if nothing much had happened, and there were many comments about how alike her husbands were.
And they're both quiet men.
Both very quiet men. They're similar types. Tall, handsome, and quiet. You can't imagine them very exciting, either of them.
But Tim and Mark are exactly the types of men that suit Anne best. Low-profile husbands who know their place.
She's a strong lady. I can't think of anybody who could really cope with Anne very successfully, and Mark and Tim are certainly two who can't. But I don't think anybody on earth could, really. Who'd really want to take Anne on as their wife? I can't think of anybody.
As the carefully managed media profiles of some of the royal family have fractured, Anne, for all her faults, is still going strong. Temperamentally, she was always the one most likely to rebel, yet she remains completely loyal to her mother and the monarchy. Unlike many others in the family, she's never gone in for image building with the media, so there's been no facade to crumble away. It's one area where she's perhaps content to have been outclassed by her rivals. She's had her share of indiscretions, but she's handled them discreetly and with dignity. For much of her life, she's been eclipsed by her elder brother. But the more daunting the burden on the House of Windsor, the more the black sheep of the family has come into her own. At 52, the Princess Royal has a dogged commitment to duty. Whether it's 5 or 6 visits in a single day in Britain, or for her recent 4-day round trip through rough seas in a cargo ship to visit an outpost of Empire. The job goes on.
Now that you've got this splendid new building, which includes all the technology that anybody in BBC local radio could possibly wish, and indeed in television, you have fortunately given me the seriously low-tech option, yes, for which I am extremely grateful. I have no doubt.
The great thing about Princess Anne is she's made this apparent transformation from difficult youngster, difficult teenager, somebody who didn't want to know anything about the media, who felt they were intrusive and rude and so on, into someone who has become almost an icon, and about whom nobody said anything very nasty at all.
She has an arrogance that is very hard to define, but she has a blinding belief that everything she has done has been correct and proper, and she's had the support of the Queen. And this belief in herself has let her sail through life fairly easily, and nothing affects her, nothing at all. It's an extraordinary thing to be able to achieve, that she is that self-sufficient.
The belief in herself means Anne sees no need to try to massage public opinion in her favour. Anne's trenchant view is that she should be judged by her work and by nothing else. That's the only thing that should bring her credit.
I know lots of people say to me, you know, she's the best of the lot. She is a much more rounded, feistier, full person than any of her three brothers. I mean, in a way, it's a great shame she wasn't born a bloke, because I think she would have made a far better sovereign than any of her three brothers.
For all that, Anne's worst enemy will always be herself. She just can't keep away from trouble for long. It's Christmas Day, and the royal family has been to church in Norfolk. Scores of royal watchers come from all over the country, armed with tokens of seasonal goodwill.
Well, Christmas Day at Sandringham is the best place that you'll ever see all the members of the royal family together. I mean, it doesn't matter whether that rain, snow, I mean, I'm always there. And the gates open at 10 o'clock, and there's a mad rush down to the corner to get this special point to see the members of the royal family come down the steps. That's really a lovely sight.
That morning, Anne took it upon herself to collect most of the flowers and gifts for her family. One veteran royal watcher proudly handed over a basket of flowers. "I've arranged them all myself," she said. But then the Christmas spirit was nipped in the bud.
And Princess Anne said, "What a ridiculous thing to do." Now, how cruel can you be? Whether it was a ridiculous thing to do is quite beside the point. This old lady thought it was a nice thing to do. You would never in a million years have heard the Queen Mum use a phrase like that.
To the delight of the press, Naff-Off Anne was back. The loyal fan she defended was Iris Halfpenny, who was always popping up with her homemade floral tributes.
That was a very sore point with Iris. She didn't come for many weeks after that. I think she was quite a bit upset over it, you know, but she didn't come. Anna's known to be abrupt anyway, but I mean, that is her manner, and we've just got to live with it.
Princess Anne's knack for putting her foot in it remains intact. But Anne won't change, and that may be her saving grace.